Hello, everyone. Welcome. I know lots of y'all are going to be joining us in the future as you watch this video. But before I start my introduction, I want to do a specific welcome to Michelle and thank you for being with us at the Country Bookshop here virtually here today. The Country Bookshop was founded in 1953, and we are so grateful to our community for making us viable and a part of your lives today and whatever year this is, 2022. And that is only because y'all buy books from us. You might buy your kids' book, your grandkids' present, a cookbook, Michelle's book, search from us. Anything. And we thank you for that. We're owned by our local newspaper, The Pilot, and we love that partnership. And I really just want to thank y'all for your interest in this conversation and for all of our author events, because this opportunity to bring the writers behind the books to you is just one of the lights of my job. So thank you for participating. I'll tell you a little about Michelle. Michelle Huneven is the author of 5 novels. Her first 2 books, Round Rock, which was published in 1997, and James Land, published in 2003, were both New York Times notable books, and they were also finalists for the LA Times Book Award. Her third novel, Blame, was published in 2009, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and also a finalist for the LA Times Book Award. Her fourth novel, Off Course, was published in 2014 and was a New York Times Editor's Choice. We are here today to chat about her excellent 5th novel, Search, published this spring. Michelle has received a GE Younger Writers Award, a Whiting Award for Fiction, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. For many years, her day job was reviewing restaurants and writing about food for the Los Angeles Times, the LA Weekly, and other publications. She has received a James Beard Award for feature writing with recipes and an assortment of other awards for food journalism. A California native, Michelle's studies included stops at Scripps, Grinnell, EWU, before she landed at Iowa Writers Workshop, where she earned her MFA. Michelle teaches creative writing to undergraduates at UCLA and is working on her next novel, writing the occasional bit about food. She was born in Altadena, the same town where she lives now, with her husband, Jim Potter, her dog, Tatty Jane, the memory of their cat, is it Panix?
Panks.
Mr. Panks. A talkative African gray parrot named Helen, 9 chickens, but no miniature donkeys. Well, Michelle, thank you for being with us today.
I'm just delighted to be here. And also, I have to say, I know exactly how old the bookstore is because that's exactly how old I am.
Well, for the 70th, we'll have to, maybe you can come join us for our party I'm planning.
That would be fantastic.
That really would. Yeah. Well, let's start maybe a brief synopsis of the book, and then I'd love for you to read this preface, which might be a great opener.
Okay, well, Search is the story of a search committee looking for their new minister at the UUCC, the Arroyo Unitarian Universalist Community Church, better known as the AUC. It's really a story about how 8 educated, intelligent, well-meaning people make some very surprising choices. It takes place over the course of a year, and it's narrated by Dana Potowski, who is a food writer and a restaurant critic. So the committee is told to meet over potluck meals, and they do. And Dana also occasionally takes, 1 to 4 people out on a restaurant review for sort of these subcommittee meetings where she gets to know people a little bit more intimately.
Would you mind opening us up by reading the preface?
Okay. So the book is a memoir with recipes written, excuse me, by Dana. And this is her preface to the 2nd edition. I never thought I'd be writing this preface, Who knew that a comic memoir with recipes about a church search committee could ever go into a second printing? Nor did I expect the talk show attention, the op-eds, and the late night parodies, or the sales. But this, my fourth book, seems to have struck a chord, not only with many churches and academics, but also with the religiously unaffiliated, who found in the seemingly tame subject of a church's search for a new minister a surprisingly dramatic, cutthroat adventure. To answer a few of the many questions readers have asked, excuse me, yes, this is a memoir of a real experience. It is not fiction. I was on a search committee for a senior minister, and this is my story of that search. Others might tell it differently. That said, names and certain details have been altered to protect identities. Several of the living have recognized themselves, although sometimes in the wrong character. Libel laws offer clear guidelines for making a person unidentifiable in print. Change 3 characteristics, for example, and I followed them. The talk of lawsuits has subsided. Some readers, and many who haven't read the book, argue that I've talked too much out of school, and by exposing the behind-the-scenes machinations of a church and its search committee, I have disclosed too many secrets, certainly more than the average credulous churchgoer cares to know. I believe that the more the average credulous churchgoer knows, the more responsible their decisions will be when choosing a leader. The health and future of their institution depend on it. A church is a human structure. We build it and inhabit it, and immediately stories and secrets abound within. It is my hope that the stories and secrets related in these pages continue to entertain and, with luck, enlighten. Dana Potowski, June 2000, something.
I love opening with the preface and to our conversation. There's so many avenues I want to take with it, but specifically, let's start with the reminder that the church is a human structure. And there are so many ways that you the book takes place in the scaffolding of that human structure, very much so. And you use certain things to bring out the mundane, and a couple of nuggets that just pepper their way through the book. Kind of the rule of 17 comes to mind, or the well, let's start with that one. Where did you hear that? How did that come into the writing? You know, in your research and in novelist knowledge before it enters the book, how did that come into your frame of reference?
Well, just like Dana, I was having lunch with my minister, and he had been, he'd had what's called a negotiated settlement with a church, which is where the minister and the congregation agree to part. It's not quite as harsh as a firing, but it's essentially an agreement to part. And he was telling me the story, and he said, it's the rule of 17. He's the one who told me that if 17 people come together in a church, they can do anything. That's kind of the tipping point. If you get 17 people to, who want to hound out a minister or change something in the church, that's how many it takes, 17. If you have 16, they don't have quite enough power.
Well, I love that. And there are other parts where nuggets in the book where it is the business of the church, and somewhere between democratic government and something else, the shooting predators on site. Could you talk a little bit about that nugget?
That's another one I took from an older minister who was asked to come back to do a new minister's installation and to provide something called the charge, which is just to give a short, 3-minute exhortation to the new minister just give them a nugget to carry with them. And this minister said that after all of his years, he was very old at this, after all of his years, he learned that the main goal of a minister is to keep an eye out for, keep a watch out and shoot predators on sight. And, you know, nobody's ever forgotten that. It's, it sounds really violent, but I think that what he meant by shooting predators on sight is there are always troublemakers, there are always soreheads, there are always people who just want to disrupt, they can't help it. And he was very clever about dealing with them. He didn't shoot them. He often gave them jobs, you know, to distract them. You know, he'd make them the head of some fund drive or some liaison with the, he'd make him a liaison with the denomination or something. He was very clever that way.
And it is interesting, all these nuggets that come together. It's an undercurrent of the book that shows examples of what a good leader for a community needs to do and has to do, and what the job is. And it's never spelled out clearly. It's kind of anecdotally peppered throughout the book in such a clever way. I mean, it's beautiful reading. You, as a person who lives reading fiction, you know, this is a novel written by a master of the craft. I mean, just the braiding together all these tendrils that come together to really do a complete portrait, as you said, of how well-meaning people can make some interesting decisions. And I want to go from that human scaffolding to talk about community, because so much of the book is ego, the search committee, but also the larger community. And can you talk about community as it exists in a church scenario?
Sure, because I thought about that a lot when I was writing this book. At the beginning of the book, Dana Potowski admits that she's a little tired of church. She's been going to the same church for like 24 years, and a lot of things have begun to annoy her, like hymns annoy her, and something the minister does annoys her, and she really hates the bell choir. But she also is yearning for a way to reattach to this community. You know, she first came to the community after her mother died. It had been a church that her mother had attended. So she went kind of in homage to her mother. And she writes about how when she first came to the church, she sat down and she began to weep. And it wasn't from grief. She knew what weeping from grief was. It was this immense relief that it's like her soul had finally come to a place where it could unfurl. And I think that's it. It's something I've noticed in church, that you can go and you can sit next to the same people, and maybe you don't talk to them, maybe you know their names just from their name tags, maybe you wave to them, but if you see them outside of church, or when you see them in church, you get this feeling of connection, because you sat there Sunday after Sunday, maybe you've been on committees year after year, and it forms this really interesting bond, because you're all there to be part of something larger than yourself. And it's all a web of connections. And I think it's so important. And it's, you know, also you have church friends that you talk to and are deeply involved with, but even these peripheral people that make up the larger community become important to you and become a part of you and become attached to you.
You know, I nodded when you said peripheral people, because that is actually my personal definition of community, is all the peripheral people. Dana, at one point in the book, talks about what it was to her to have, you know, when she thinks back to how the church ladies supported her when she was doing her cooking classes. Who showed up? The church ladies showed up, and just these, all of these things that create community. And in the book, the search committee, that I think is formed in a very, you write it in a very practical way. Some people get on for varying reasons that I think is very true to life, or likely true to life. But you talk about, there was one word that they all wrote in their applications, which also seems like a reasonable way to choose a search committee as well. But can you speak to that a little bit?
Can I say the word? Is it a spoiler?
I think it's fun.
They all said that the church was their spiritual home. They all used the word home. And yeah, they are a kind of misbegotten group. One thing is they're way too big. They're 8 people. And it's advised that 6 or 7 is better. And it's good to have an odd number group, because then you can't get locked, 4 against 4. But I did that sort of deliberately, because I'm, in a novel, there has to be conflict. And they're told that they're going to get close to one another. But like Dana really just, what she wants is one good person to laugh and kind of nudge with her elbow and say, oh my God, can you believe what so-and-so wore to the, to the meeting, or what they made for dinner, or whatever. They are advised to eat at every meal, at every meeting. And so that forms community too. But so there's a thing of having one ally on the committee. Dana always says that if she ever had to go to prison or end up in an old age home, she'd be fine if there's one person that she could have good long conversations with. And I kind of feel that way too. But at the same time, here's this group of 8 people, and they are charged with becoming a miniature model of the church. There's one person from every decade, except for the 40s. I think there are 2 from the 40s. They're racially somewhat balanced. There's 4 women and 4 men. The split eventually comes between the young and the old.
There's so much to talk about, but I want to take a moment and talk about the form that you chose to write this book in. And leading off with the preface, which opens the book, gives people who might be listening who haven't read the book a sense of, this is written as a memoir. And I love the opportunity that gives you to I think it adds this layer of potential thoughtfulness within the reader, because Dana's not perfect, but Dana's also trying. And just the form that you deliver the story in gives us an exceptionally interesting layer of self-reflection, or possibly, or just a different lens to see Dana through as she encounters, the year's worth of things she encounters in the book. Can you talk about, as you were structuring the book, did you know it was going to be a memoir? Why did you choose a fictional memoir? Why did you choose it to be we can talk about the recipes in a second, but just this, it's so intriguing to me, and I love how it functions, but I want to know why.
That's a good question. I think it adds, well, you say that Dana's not perfect. And one of the ways she's not perfect is that she's secretly writing a book she's planning to write a book about this whole search. It's one of the reasons why she wanted to get on the search. She's published 3 books. They've done well. Her editor is bugging her. What's your next book? We got to keep moving here. We got to keep, getting these books coming out. And when her minister confides in her that he's thinking of retiring and he thinks that she would be good on the search committee, she thinks, well, a search takes a year. There are all these books that have taken a year, like a year of reading only the Bible, a year of having sex every day, a year of not buying anything new. And so she thinks, well, good, I'll have this nice structure and I'll have a cast of characters. So that's one of her motivations for getting on the committee. It's not exactly admirable to be sneakily taking notes because you're going to write a book and to not tell anybody. I think that it does add kind of a comic layer, because at one point she says her husband has forbidden her to put him in the book, because the last time she put him in a book, which was a book called Yard to Table about her backyard gardening, she said that he kissed chickens, and he's a lawyer. And so there was a lawyer in his office who yelled down the hallway, "It's the man who kisses chickens," and embarrassed him. So there are moments like that. But then when he reads the first draft of the book, he thinks it needs something, and it needs either a husband or a love affair. And he said, so you better put me in.
It's interesting when it comes to this, as you alluded to, the ultimate conflicts in this committee are along generational divides. And Dana's, it's just such a good book, Michelle. I want to talk about everything. I just really, I want to go in to talk about Dana's relationship with Jenny, how is it pronounced? Jenny, who's kind of the catalyst of the younger group, and all that comes together in this committee. And instead of going different ways, I'm curious about, as you were writing the book and exploring the different ways committees can function or not function, and how you chose to make this committee both function and be dysfunctional. And did you know the different tension points that you were going to strike, or did those come through as you were writing?
Well, the Unitarian Universalist Association has a handbook and a resource pamphlet for those people who are on search committees. And I was on a search committee once, so I got them. And what they are is, you can tell by reading them all the problems that search committees have ever faced. It's like, this is how big it should be. This is how you should hold your meetings. This is what your covenant should read like all voices should be heard, including those soft-spoken. Nobody should speak too long. You shouldn't talk out of school. Everything should be confidential. All of these are just like a list of everything that has ever gone wrong in a search committee. You can just kind of turn it the other way. So ideally, I could have heard from search committees, but they're highly confidential, and I couldn't get anybody to talk. So I really had to make it up. I mean, I got a few things. Somebody one time told me that their search committee had broken down along generational lines. So I used that. But I think that anybody who's been on a committee, whether it's a search committee or not, can provide you with lots of details about what could possibly go wrong and what could possibly go right. Once I began to tell people that I was writing about a search committee, I heard, amazing stories. I was at a party once and talking to a couple, and I told them what I was writing about. And the woman said, "Oh, I've been on a search." And her husband said, "I'm going to go get a drink. I've heard enough."
We have some people at the bookstore. I've gotten similar. It's been quite frankly, wonderful opportunity for me to have highly specific conversations with people from a variety of churches. They're giving their thoughts and unburdening, and fiction can do that. Fiction can allow us perspective and freedom to speak in ways that sometimes real life is too close to speak about, which is why I think this book is such an opportunity for our community in Southern Pines and around Moore County. There's advice. I will talk about this friendship in a minute, but there's a little bit of advice given by Dana's old friend from seminary. Oh dear, I dropped my pencil. Which I have written down here. And she says, to quote you, when professionals decide, it's cleaner. Search committees are amateurs and apt to be dazzled by personality and lose track of what their church needs. Or they compromise on a third choice because the top two have polarized them. I want Minnie, you want Jim, so we'll settle on Harriet, who nobody likes. I'm sorry, whom no one much likes. And I'm wondering through this process, I understand committees were quiet, but what did you learn about the different structure ways? And you mentioned, Dana talks about some in the book, that this particular search committee process is structured within different denominations. What did you learn about that?
Well, of course, Catholics and some Protestant churches are top down. They're kind of just, the clergy is picked from above. The Methodists are interesting because the bishops place their ministers, but there's a whole system of communication that I understand. I'm not an expert on this, but I understand there's a system of communication where there's a district supervisor who talks to the minister and the church to find out what they want. Does the minister want to stay or go? Does the church want them to stay or go? And I think that there's like committees in the church that talk to the district superintendent or supervisor. Anyway, it's a different process, but ultimately, the bishop meets once a year and makes all these decisions, and it's like a big arranged marriage, who goes where, and they try to make everybody happy, because who wants unhappy clergy? So that's a more top-down version. A lot of churches do search committees. They do smaller committees. So that's as much as I've been able to find out.
Well, it's so much of this book is the friend who said that was a friend of Dana's from when she was in seminary. Mm-hmm. And she has a lot of anxiety about this relationship. And then when they run into each other, they come immediately together. And I'm wondering why, kind of stepping back and looking at overarching themes. I mean, I have my own theory, but since I get to talk to you, I'm going to ask you why you had this friend from one moment in her life reappear, and why did you structure that into the novel? What do you hope? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I definitely wanted to write about friendship, because it's a kind of a subtext in the book. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it is that every small discussion group I've ever led at church or been a part of in church, where people, have to bare their souls a little bit, and I would say in every single one, somebody will talk about a ruptured friendship. Somebody will say, like, an older man will say, I've been talking to this friend of mine for 35 years every week, and now he's not answering my calls. He's not calling me. I don't know what's going on. And I think that, you know, friendship is such a voluntary activity, and we grow apart. We grow together, we grow apart. In the case of Dana and her friend Helen Harlan, they were in seminary together. They were really great friends. They were the kind of friend that Dana always wants, you know, where they laughed at all the bad sermons that people were preaching in seminary, and they, you know, they giggle about this and that, and study together and talk every night on the phone. And then Dana doesn't finish seminary, but Helen does, and Helen goes on and she gets a church and has such a terrible experience at that church that she leaves ministry and she leaves the friendship. She leaves everything kind of that's associated with that. And so when Dana sees her after 16 years of not talking to her, it's uncanny because they pick up right where they left off, the way good friends do when you haven't seen somebody for a while, you know, you just pick up. But Dana's also wary because she was so hurt by this person ghosting her, essentially. So Dana, I mean, you know, there are a couple searches going on in this book, and one is the search for a new minister, but there's also Dana sort of searching for a new way to have community, a new way to befriend people. You know, she's just at an itchy stage in life. And the appearance of an old friend is such balm to her, and also so kind of terrifying because she lost so much. Yeah, so that's why I put it in, I think. Also, Helen Harland is in Jamesland. She's a minister. If you want to read about her bad church experience, read Jamesland.
You know, to me also, it struck me just, and I thought you were going there when you answered, in functioning in a church, you know, you may be part of a Bible study or some sort of small group where you have intense friendships within the context of this committee or this, you know, moment along the path.
Mm-hmm.
And then the path turns, and so much of the book is about these longer paths. And I know you found the painting that was ultimately the cover, and to me this speaks to this concept of path and the seasons and the searching, whether it's, you know, on the church's path, all the ministers you might get along the church's path, or the friendships on a human path, or what we're discovering about ourselves and our own egos and how we can function. Can you talk a little bit about why this cover meant something to you and why everyone unanimously agreed to it, which never happens?
Oh, it's so, here it is, sort of color enhanced. I went to a small art show in Alhambra because a friend of mine, it was a group show, a friend of mine had a piece in that show, and I walked in and here was this 5 by 8 foot painting that you could almost walk into. That's how big the actual painting is. And I looked at it, and it seemed incredibly familiar to me from one of those dreams that I had once. And I also just thought immediately this would make a great cover for my book. And then I looked at whose it was, and it was a woman I knew. I didn't know her well, but I teach at UCLA, and she's at all the English events. She's you know, at all the readings, she and her husband. And so I took a picture of it, and I don't know, months later, my wonderful editor, Ginny, asked me, Ginny Smith, if I had any ideas for the book cover. Now, this is my 5th book, and I've been through it on book covers. Some I've liked, some I've tried desperately to change. I know that the author has very little say in the matter. And so I said to her, I sent her a picture of the painting and I said, here's something that might give you an idea. I didn't say use this. I said, this could give you an idea. Because what I didn't want was, like, as somebody suggested, a church with chopsticks, or a church with a frying pan, or, and to my surprise and utter delight, Ginny liked it. And I think, whoever she sent it to next, marketing, the publisher, it had to go through a series of approvals, I think. And they wouldn't let me tell Astrid Preston, who'd painted it. I thought, can I call Astrid? And they're like, no, not yet. We're still, waiting to make sure it's going to be it. And then they finally called Astrid and told her, and she said she was so excited she couldn't sleep all night.
I love that she is a book lover and shows up at the readings. And as someone who puts on readings all the time, I know every single person I'm so grateful to anybody who comes to a reading. I know exactly who you all are, even those of you at a virtual reading. And I'm so grateful. And I love that that's who the artist was. And I want to talk about the sermons. So throughout this search process, we get to go with Dana as she is vetting with the group, the candidates. And I'm curious, and I love the sermons, and I'm curious about the writing process of each minister, but particularly the sermons. Did you have the idea for these different sermons and then build who's giving them from there? Did you have a particular, how did that writing process work for you?
Well, in addition to having 8 characters on the search committee, they confront 17 ministers who apply for the job, more or less, and they have to winnow them out. And I think, there's partial sermons, there's extracts from, I don't know how many ministers, and then there's big chunks for the candidates, the final, the pre-candidates, they're called. And I just had to write a lot of sermons based on, I had to think deeply about character. I had to think how they would write the sermon, what it would be about, what was their theology, how it would sound when it was delivered. So I had to put character into sermons in addition to writing them. I enjoyed that, I think, because I went to seminary for 2 years and I took a homiletics class, a preaching class, and preaching really was my favorite thing about it. I love the sermon. I think it's a beautiful form because it contains story, anecdote, poetry, ideas, wisdom, textual analysis. It's such a big, beautiful form, even though it's a short form. I've heard said, and I like to say, that ministry and novel writing are both two of the few remaining openings for generalists. People that are kind of interested in a lot of things. What can you do? Well, you could be a minister, and you could be a novelist.
And you could be a bookseller.
Yes. Yes.
But when I said earlier, it's written by somebody who knows the craft, that your character development and how, you have such all that thought that goes into it. It's felt by the reader. I mean, it's to have a complete character who just blips on the page. And I mean, you, in some of these candidates, you accomplish that. And it is what makes this such a robust, fulfilling story. So thank you. I am curious, And we have some questions. One I'm going to save for last because it may have some spoilers, but I think it is a valuable question. And so I have so many questions. Talking about character, you have recipes in the book, which is such a treat. And I'm curious because I know the time you spent with character development. Different recipes go with different characters? Did you already have the recipes, or did the characters determine what kind of food you wanted associated with them? Or were you cooking while you were writing the book and were thinking, Jenny would make this? And can you talk about that confluence of character and recipe?
Yeah, it's similar to the confluence between characters and sermons. I got to know my characters as I wrote the book, kind of as Dana got to know them. And little things would happen that I didn't expect. Like, I didn't expect Jenny to be a good baker. I mean, she's really brash. She's kind of rambunctious. She can be obnoxious and grating, but she does have one undeniable talent, which is that she knows how to pick a good recipe, and she knows how to make it so that it turns out well. And Belinda, who's the oldest member of the group, she is a gourmet cook. And so when she hosts, she makes these, delicious things. It's fun because I'm beginning to get feedback on the book, and like 2 people have written to me that they've used the salmon marinade recipe and they just love it. It's this recipe that I use all the time too. So yeah, it was fun to characterize people by their recipes. Of course, some of the people just bought, like supermarket sandwiches and bagged lettuce and bottled dressing, where other people just made everything from scratch. Dana makes everything from scratch. Belinda does. Uptight Charlotte is mostly a rotisserie chicken kind of gal. She'll buy a rotisserie chicken or pre-made sandwiches, but every now and then she'll do something like cook a brisket in a really warm and inviting way. That was
I love how it multifaceted the people on the committee are, and how you use recipes to do that. Because as you said, when I first asked you to open this conversation, how do well-meaning people, good people, smart people struggle in this specific function? And it's a universal struggle in this specific function. It's a very specific role. And one of the things I do love about the book is I came away with very specific tools to move forward and search. For example, just being clear at the beginning what the church needs. And how is that different from, and as you said in your preface, do people understand the inner workings of the church, the business of it, the fact that there's a building involved, or rentals, or staff management, in addition to sermons? And just, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful story, but also just a wonderful guidepost in a way. And I want to thank you for that. I have, as I mentioned, one question in here. Anybody else who's on here who has any other specific questions, now would be the time to pop them in the chat. I want to also mention that there is a book club kit that's on your website that when we send this recording out, we'll also link to. And I know many people who are watching this later or right now are planning to read this with their book club or a one-time book club. But one of the questions that's in the book club kit that is this, it addresses the ongoing conflict between ego and community, and ego and the committee. And I was wondering if you could speak, I probably already asked that, but it's what's so fascinating about this structure. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure. They've been charged to form a church, and they kind of forget that charge. They kind of forget that they forget the larger picture because they get polarized, and because there are personalities involved. There's also level of care. This is one thing that Dana learns, is that she starts out cynically wanting to write a book, and yet it's sort of like her experience at church. You know, you go and you sit down, you go and you sit down, and then one day you realize, you know, you hear that the person across the aisle that you always see is ill, and you feel like, oh my God, they're ill. You feel attached to them, and you're surprised that just sitting in the same room with someone would give you a sense of connection. Dana is surprised that by being involved in this search, she's come to care a great deal, where there are other people that are more strategic. Like there's a tied vote at one point between two young candidates, and one of the old, and they keep voting, and the young people don't move, and the old people don't move, the young people don't move, the old people don't move. And finally, an old person moves. And by, you know, they're not that differentiated in age, but this is one of the first, and an old person moves. And Dana is like, oh my God, you of all people, why did you move? And she says, well, you know, I want to show the young people what that people can change their minds, that you can listen and you can hear and you can decide to change your mind. She wants to model that. So whether or not that works, we'll see.
I was also curious because it is generational lines that this committee comes in conflict over. When did you write this book, and what was going? It seems like so much is breaking along generational lines these days. And I'm curious what was going on kind of in the world as you were writing this book, and because the timing is interesting to me.
Yeah, I think in my head, I placed the book in around 2014, because I didn't want to get into the greater partisanship that's, you know, taken root in this country. But at the same time, I wanted to write about partisanship and how it happens and how we get so cemented in our own points of view. So that the ideal of consensus, you know, the idea that we can all put in our input and together, you know, become the church, and together decide on the correct leader for the church. How far away that seems, and you know, we're an almost equally divided country, and I kept thinking about that, you know, that it can go either way. It's just dependent on this group of voters that move, you know, right and left, and for whatever reason. So I kept democracy and the idea of democracy and the state of our democracy in mind when I was writing this book. But to say one more thing about the divide between young and old, you know, the old are very tradition bound and everything, and they know that you need an experienced manager and everything. But what the young want isn't so bad either. They look at their older counterparts and they say, look, you know, you had a minister who was the same age as you were, who came and had kids that were the same age as your kids, and you grew up together in the church, and that was great. We want a minister who's our age, who will, you know, model things for us and that we can grow up with. And that makes a lot of sense.
It's fascinating. I mean, I really thank you for the gift of this book. And right now, I'm going to switch to the spoiler alert part of our conversation. So if you have not read the book, sign off or pause your video. Take your time, because it's such a gorgeous book. I don't want to spoil it for you. Julia has asked a question in the chat, one of our live attendees. And her question is, at what point in the creation of the book did you decide / know the ending? Did the book ever end differently?
That is a good question. I think I always knew how the book would end. And I don't necessarily need to spoil it. I think we were heading that way. What became interesting and complicated to me was getting there. And also, I did some work on the ending because the person who gets in needed to be enriched, and she's, oops.
It's okay. We've warned everyone. I think everyone here has read the book.
She's not what obviously everybody wanted initially, but she's a little bit different from what her opposition thinks she is. I think that comes clear at the end, that she's had a little bit more experience and has a little bit more spine, maybe.
Since we're in the spoiler alert part, what I love, the takeaway is, if it's not working, you pause, you make a new committee, you find a new thing, that this is the long term, that success or failure is not, it gives such a larger perspective to the search. And it reminds you, so many of the problems in this is that everyone is tunnel visioned,
Right.
And cannot keep in mind the bigger church community, cannot keep in mind the longer portion. At one point, I forget if it's Charlotte or Belinda, but she's like, we cannot go back to the drawing board. We don't have time to pre-candidate somebody. We have all these external things. And just, I love the way you end it, because as a book in and of itself is one thing, but what it does to the reader and the perspective it gives the reader and those of us interacting with this fiction is promising. And that's why I love it for our communities. It's just a promising piece of fiction for us to all talk about. And as we all encounter changes in our own communities and lives and committees, church or not, I'm really excited for everyone to read this book and talk about it and disagree with it and not like the ending or want it to end differently, and then rewrite our own little lives so that it ends really well.
Yeah. Who would you choose from among our 17 applicants?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I like Walt,
Yeah.
of course. And, Jenny should have recused herself. The entire structure of the committee obviously should have been different. You set it up that way, so we have our fiction tension. But I love how clarifying it is for me as a reader to be like, well, we don't do that. We shouldn't do that. And just the clarity of vision it gave me as a reader, and also things I did not necessarily think about. A reminder, just as we began the conversation, that the church is a human structure. The scaffolding is just human decisions and attention, and just the larger perspective that is needed. It's not about necessarily a good sermon. It's about the whole picture, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. Well, what are you working on now?
Well, I'm in the middle of book tour, so I'm not writing a lot, but I have started another novel about the man who used to live on my property, who was a eugenicist and wrote a textbook for eugenics. It was actually read by the Nazis. He was a well-meaning progressive man, like many eugenicists were. He wanted to make the human race better. When things fell out of favor with eugenics after World War II and the Nazis, Nazi atrocities were made known in the name of eugenics, he had to switch his focus, obviously. And so he is the man who invented marriage counseling. He's famous also for being the co-writer of the longest running column in magazine history, Can This Marriage Be Saved?, that ran in Ladies' Home Journal. He's just a fascinating character. He was very tall and very charismatic and very sparkling, and just took kind of a wrong turn in life.
Did you ever, it's so periodic. They did it for a while in the Sunday New York Times, and they would check in with people 10 years after their divorce and like see how they were doing. I always found that fascinating.
A friend of mine, Louise Rafkin, always wrote those, and she had a really hard time finding divorced people to write about. So if anybody wants to talk about their divorces, she'd be happy to talk to you.
As a child of parents who are divorced, I always really enjoyed, and sometimes it was better, sometimes it wasn't. There were different practical things. I thought the perspective that it gave was fascinating. I'm also curious, this is a rumor, and maybe as you're diving deep into this, you'll discover this. I heard once that, and this is out of left field, but that what is now a party drug, ecstasy, was actually invented in Dallas by a minister marriage counselor as a marriage therapy drug, who's like a former physicist or chemist or something. Have you ever heard anything about that?
Well, I know that it's called the love drug. I've never taken it myself, but I teach it creative writing at UCLA, and I had a number of stories about how lovey-dovey it makes you feel.
Well, can you tell me a little bit, because we have a few more minutes, about what kind of things come across your desk as a creative writing instructor for undergraduates at UCLA, other than some love drug stories?
Actually, I tell my students they can't write about drugs or clubs or parties, because they're fun to go to, but they don't have the chops to write about them that make it interesting to other people. But then, well, I get a lot of insight into immigrant life, because I have a lot of immigrant students. Gosh, does anything else? Of course, everybody's so idiosyncratic. It's fun to deal with students. You just never know what they're going to write about. But I'm trying to think if there's been anything that's been, I have some really good writers. I also teach food writing, and that food writing has actually been a revelation, because it's an example of how quickly community forms around food, because I teach fiction writing, and we like each other in class, and sometimes they form a workshop afterwards. But in the food writing class, it's like, when can we have a picnic? When can we eat together? When can we meet outside of class and do something together? Another thing that's really heartened me about the food writing class is just how tuned in students are to the difficulties facing our planet in terms of food supply and climate change and supply chains and just all the issues in food. They're really on top of it. They really want to do something about it. I really am getting convinced that they're going to save the planet. They are, this generation.
I agree with you. I have a 5-year-old and also a 20-year-old. And I tell all of my friends who are my age, who don't interact with that specific college age, who are freaking out, I'm like, these kids are brilliant. We will all be okay. We will all be okay. Well, I have one last question. So when you won your James Beard Award, was there a award ceremony? Was there a party? And if there was, what was it like?
Oh, there was a big award ceremony. We flew to New York. It was a big, gala, big deal. What do you wear? I bought a dress. I didn't know if I'd won or not. They announced it, and I was rooming with a friend who was also nominated in the same category. And I asked to be seated at a table with the food critic from Vogue because I admired his writing so much, Jeffrey Steingarten. And also at the table was Jonathan Gold, who is a friend of mine, who is the only food critic to ever win a Pulitzer Prize. So I was really excited to be seated with Jeffrey Steingarten. But man, the two of them got into a competitive talk and nobody could break in, nobody could participate. Where was the best gelato in the world? That went on for, they just had to show each other who'd been, where they'd been. I mean, it was a real classic thing. And then I won, which surprised me because for my piece, I'd really just braised everything in my refrigerator.
Oh, no.
And written about it. And so anyway, I won. That was fun. And then I went back to the hotel room with my friend and coworker, who was so angry at me and angry that she hadn't won. She wouldn't talk to me.
Oh, thank you for telling me that story. Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I want to thank all of y'all who are here, still listening. I've gone over the hour, and all of y'all who may be watching this in the future, for your interest in this book, for your interest in Michelle. If we'll be emailing this out, please send a link of this conversation, including that they can buy the book at the Country Bookshop, to anybody who you think might enjoy it or be interested. The book club kit, I think this is a really important book, and I think it's one of those that exists exceptionally well in its own form, but it has the opportunity to do what fiction's made to do, which is make us think and see differently and talk about it. And Michelle, thank you for that. And thank you for taking the time to talk with me and all of us in Southern Pines and Moore County through the Country Bookshop today.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I'm happy to talk to book clubs if they need, if they want to hear from the author in person.
Well, we will include that. Our book club coordinator, Beth Carpenter, who's also a brilliant baker, is on right now. So she will most definitely be sure to include a link to your website or how we can get in touch with you.
Right. Thank you so much.